Right, so greetings, hello, welcome to the Philosophy Club here in Betete for our weekly seminar. It's Saturday, and I believe it's the 21st of January, and it's very cold at the moment, but we're going to warm our hearts with some intellectual discourse. And what we're going to do today, slightly differently, is instead of me going on about individual boxes, we've done all that. We've now completed the box per box analysis of the table. Sadly, not all of them were recorded, but we've had them over the last, 5 months or something. And there are talks of me talking about the table, box by box, recorded previously at the castle in Scotland. So, but what we're going to do now is something totally new, and I've been planning this for a while. What interests me as a scholar is the relationship between the boxes. As an expert in interfaith studies, I specialise in interfaith, and that means literally, from one tradition to another, what's the relationship? Those are the fault lines of intellectual history, and the conflict lines. So as a specialist in peace studies and conflict studies, that's what interests me particularly. And I want, as we proceed, we'll take 2 boxes at a time, and my colleague will ask me, what's the relationship between this box and that box? And then I'll give an analysis of what that is, any conflicts that are ongoing or that have happened in the past, any solutions to those conflicts, and any creative lines, because these boxes all influence each other. And I'd like to live in a world where, we have a sort of permacultural principle of gardening applied to them. So these are all parts of the garden or the forest, and they can live symbiotically and nourish each other instead of declaring war on each other like piranha plants, as is going on at the moment. So this is sort of exercise in the permacultural gardening of the mind and spirit. Right, okay, without further ado, so go for it. Let's have the first 2 boxes you've chosen.
Right. I want to know about the relationship between Kantian philosophy,
right,
and voodoo.
Ha! That's interesting. Okay, Kantian philosophy is number 132, down on the bottom right in the yellow philosophy load, and then voodoo is in the new religious movements here, box 104 in the grey area. Right. Okay, that's an interesting one. Raises lots of interesting and complex questions. At the time Kant was alive and teaching in Germany, in Königsberg, in the late 18th century, slavery was still legal in all of Europe. So slaves were still being taken from Africa to the New World and to the West Indies and all the rest of it. Germany wasn't really involved in that slave trade, interestingly enough. I don't think there'd be any slave ships running out of Königsberg. I suspect Kant never met any slavers. It's possible he might have, I doubt it very much, but there might have been a few black slaves in Germany, in the aristocratic homes, possibly, I don't know. Unlikely. There were certainly in England, and we've got paintings of black slaves who were brought to England and then attached to sort of wealthy families. There were also a lot of black slaves who were in London. Some of them had run away and they joined the sort of underlife of London, and some had been released. There was the beginnings of the anti-slavery movement in London, in England, and so there was a sort of black consciousness developing. And during Kant's lifetime, the American War of Independence happened, and slavery was an issue during the American War of Independence because, and this is a little known fact I learned from the great historian Simon Sharma, who wrote a book about it called Rough Crossings. The British actually, in order to win the revolution against these pesky rebels, they declared all slaves to be free if they would come and join their lines and escape from the Americans. Any black slave that got out from the plantation and crossed the river and got to the British Army was given their freedom immediately, which is interesting. And quite a lot did, actually. And whereas the white American, like, you know, Washington and all the sort of founding fathers of the American Revolution, a lot of them were slavers, including Jefferson, and they were in no way going to give freedom to their slaves. So in fact, from a moral perspective, if Kant was going to analyse the moral, and he probably did, he probably, you know, thought about this a lot. I don't think he knew what I'm telling you. I don't know if it was commonly known that the British Army in the New World had offered freedom to the slaves if they joined the Crown. Certainly the Americans never let this on in their propaganda of being the great nation of the revolutionary. We're the Americans, we defeated the British. You know, like, cheers, what about the slaves? They never mentioned that. And it took till 1860s for the Americans to get rid of slavery. Whereas the British sort of started getting rid of it then. And then once we got a Liberal government in Parliament, they abolished it entirely, like about 1832. So Kant probably knew some of this. He was certainly against slavery in principle because he believed passionately in freedom, what he called moral autonomy. You can't, when you're trying to think about ethics, you know, is it right to wear long hair? You know, like, that was a big issue at school in my day, you know, and we would go on hunger strike to have our long hair, you know. And then the teachers would say, no, you can't have long hair, it's not right. So Kant would say about a situation like that, or bigger issues, like, is it okay to bear arms? That's a big thing in America at the moment. You know, should I have a handgun in my house? Am I allowed that morally? Not just legally, but morally. He said that if you're forced into a particular moral decision, that doesn't count as an ethical choice. You're being forced to do that. So, you know, only the free will can be ethical, is what Kant said. So, I mean, that is just, he's obviously totally against slavery. And when the French Revolution broke out in the 1790s, at the culmination of the Enlightenment, he was in favour of it. He thought, finally, people will be free. And the French did get rid of slavery in that first heady period of the French Revolution. And they had blacks from Haiti come into the Congress and got cheers, and they wanted freedom for everybody, you know, black or white. Unfortunately, it didn't last, because when Napoleon got into power and sort of created his empire, he brought it back. But it then took for the Republic to come back for it to finally go in France. Meanwhile, the British had got rid of it, but the Americans were slow to do it. So that's, you know, we could talk more about that. I mean, I'm sure people have written about Kant on slavery. It'd be very interesting to study that. And we should also bear in mind that in Russia, which was quite close to where Kant was living, there was still serfdom, which was a kind of slavery. The serfs attached to the aristocrats that ran Russia were not able to leave the farms. They couldn't just say, I'm off to Petersburg for a holiday, do you mind? I mean, no, there was no freedom of movement. They had like passports. They had to stay on the farms. And so when the communists took over, everyone thought we'll all be free, but actually they just kept the same system. Under communism, you couldn't move where you wanted. And even today in Russia, you can't. There are huge parts that are declared military bases. You can't go there. And that's how they did the Holodomor in Ukraine. They denied freedom of movement to the Ukrainians. Anyway, Kant probably knew about slavery in Russia, and you know, he died in 1804, but long enough to see it abolished in France, and I think that's why he was so happy. Okay, voodoo. Right, meanwhile, in Africa, a load of these slaves are practicing their indigenous religions. They're being taken to the New World, not happy about it, and the one thing they can do is hold on to their ancestral faith. So they're bringing little, well, they probably wouldn't get away with that as slaves captured. They couldn't actually bring any portable gods and figurines, but they knew how to make them. So when they got to the plantations and all over the southwestern part of the USA, they began reconfiguring their ancestral African worship. And also in Haiti, under French colonial rule. And really voodoo is just piety towards the gods, African style, which were gods of nature, the lower. They're the gods of fire, water, earth. It's exactly like Druidry. It's no different. It's a pagan, polytheistic, animistic worship. And it had an interesting blending going on, particularly in the French colony of Haiti, because they were speaking French. And they took some French archetypal figures, like the devil. One of the devils was called Baron Samedi, I think. And they saw him as an impeccably dressed Frenchman on the streets of Paris, twirled moustache, white suit, cane, white gloves, impeccably spoken, well spoken. Hello, I'm greeting you, my friend. In impeccable French. And the voodoo people had a shrine to him. He was like one of the top gods. So, there was a humour. There's a good humour in voodoo, which people don't realise. You see, the white plantation owners were terrified of these blacks doing their native pagan rituals. And if they caught them, they had to steal off to the forest to do it at night, because on the plantations they lived in one particular region in some huts and stuff. And they had a relative freedom, so they used that relative freedom to go off and do their rituals. And from time to time they'd be caught. They'd hear funny drumming up in the forest or the hill. And then they would punish them. And if you had a fanatical Christian slave owner of the plantation, he'd call it devil worship and whip them and you name it, See, tragically, would that man have been a Kantian? Some of those slave owners were, quote unquote, intellectual, They all knew their Bible. But Kant was of a generation that was starting to critique the Bible. He was saying, where's the rational meaning behind these ancient stories? What is this God, and how can I find that guidance within my moral self? It's very unlikely that a plantation owner would be whipping slaves if he'd read Kant. He would have been on a different trip. So I think Kant was just beginning to be read in England around this time. Coleridge, the poet, was translating him, and the Romantic Poets Circle, Coleridge, Byron, they were all reading Kant. Coleridge translated it from German, and it was a mark of intellectual sophistication among English intellectuals to have read German philosophy, because it was deeper than anything that they'd been writing in England. In England, they'd gone down the materialist, atomistic route. If you couldn't measure it, weigh it, count it, it wasn't real. Which was science, and fine, they invented the atomic, table and all that. But I think it took, in terms of ethics, it took people in the wrong direction. You cannot get ethics from atomic theory, which is why I've created the periodic table of the world's religious and philosophical traditions. Anyway, now fast forward, voodoo is alive and well in some of the great urban centres of the world. In New York, there are voodoo temples. In New Orleans, in London, Paris, these are African people who are proud of their heritage and want to reaffirm it. They write books about it, they study their gods, and religious studies scholars have been looking at all this. Some of them may well be highly intellectual who've done a degree in philosophy. Some of them are very clever people. In Paris, I bet there are some Kantian voodoo people who see no problem in combining their native African traditions with Western intellectual scientific traditions. The two go together. They can. Just as I combine my Druid sort of interests with my intellectual interests of classical philosophy. So I'm sure, and New York, for all we know, there's probably a couple of professors teaching African studies who have a little voodoo temple on the side and give classes on world ethics. And I think in African philosophy, which is a thing, there are many great African intellectuals at the moment who are reading Kant and then wanting to go beyond him, and like inventing. There's probably somebody's done many learned papers on, how can traditional African spirituality, what can it take that's useful from Western thinkers like Kant and stuff, and then can it go further? One of the arguments is that, well, we need to embrace all of nature in our ethics. So people like Peter Singer have said Kant and co. just looked into human responsibilities, but actually we have responsibilities to animals, to the forest, to Mother Earth. So eco-ethics is a thing, and I suspect that there are some African philosophers beginning to explore that. Okay, is that enough of an answer?
Mm.
Okay, good. It's a good question though. Right, number two.
Number two. Okay, I'm looking for something else. I'll stick in the next one. For now, can we look at Tantric Buddhism and philosophy, feminism, masculinism?
Okay, that's a jolly good one. Yeah, so that's Tantra in the Buddhist tradition is number 26. About 80 million people, roughly, are following that. Not just in Tibet, but, Bhutan and all over. And then, of course, widely dispersed throughout further afield, also Mongolia and places. And now in the West, in France and Britain and elsewhere, and America. So that's Tantra, 26. And then in philosophy, we're going for, what's the box number?
148.
148.
Mm.
Right. Okay, that's that's feminism and masculinism. And roughly about 50 million people follow this, I would say, as their main thing. When you ask them what's reality, they say, well, I'm a feminist, and the status of women being oppressed is absolutely atrocious, and they're campaigners, it's their full-on thing. And I've known lots of feminists. I'm a sort of feminist myself, but not a fanatical one. And then the masculinist thing is there because that's the men's movement. That's Robert Bly and people saying, okay, the feminists are doing their thing, we love them. Actually, us men have got to do our thing as well, get our act together, and stop beating up the women. We have to redefine what it is to be a man. And because the women alone doing feminism isn't going to help if the men are all still killers and rapists. And I had a very interesting discussion online today with my Restorative Justice International Circle about this, because we were discussing school shootings in America and the trauma they cause. And they're all done by men who are now, virtually every week in America, somebody's bursting into a school and shooting at kids. I mean, what? It's so bonkers. And it's always men. So masculinism is the study of men's studies, and why do these young shooters do that? Why do they think that to be macho is to go and kill somebody in a classroom? I mean, it's the most pathetic and sad thing. Okay, right, what's the link between Tantra and that? Okay, that's a good question. Well, very, very ancient and profound. I mean, Tantra began even before Buddhism. I mean, it was there in the primordial Paleolithic prehistoric shamanism. The idea that male and female have a sort of dynamic energy, they co-create the universe through their polarities. And it manifests in Taoism, the yin-yang symbol that we all know. It manifests in the Shiva Shakti traditions of Hinduism, which are very ancient. One of my great colleagues who's dead now, Nick Douglas, wrote books on the history of Tantra and stuff. He also wrote a history of the Black Hat Buddhist traditions, who are the Karmapas, who are the practitioners of Tantra par excellence. And Chogyam Trungpa was part of that school. He first woke me to the depth of Buddhist Tantric Vajrayana traditions. And he founded Sami Ling in Scotland. And then went to America and founded the Naropa University, which is flourishing. You can do degrees in Tantric Buddhism there. Amazing place. And they do transpersonal psychology and stuff at Naropa University. Okay, so it's really ancient. Buddha himself was a kind of master tantric practitioner, if you want, in that he'd explored these subtle places within himself of these polarities. We all carry within us masculine and feminine energies, I think, Tantra teachers, but we choose one predominates in a given lifetime. You know, we have a male body. I've got a male body now, but it was revealed to me the other night in a dream that we have, during our entire incarnational cycle of, 1,000 lives to reach enlightenment, we have an equal number of male and female bodies. That's just what came to me in a dream. I don't know if it's true. I've never seen even any speculation on that mathematically. I think it's interesting. If it's true, then what we do is we learn over many lives to be compassionate to both sexes, because we've been them all. You know, so if you're one life, you're a woman, be compassionate to the men, because it's not easy being a man. And vice versa, if you're a man, be compassionate to the women. So Tantra's all about learning compassion for the other and transcending that otherness differentiation, because ultimately Buddha's enlightenment teaching is that there's only the we. There isn't an ego anywhere. There's just varieties of we-ness. Whether you're a group of friends, you know, the we is a fun experience. And one of the highest forms of that is a couple, a tantric couple, who are consciously practicing towards enlightenment. In tantric Buddhism, that's what you can do that. I call it a wisdom affair. And with your consort, you explore these higher states of consciousness. And it can include sexual experience as well, in all its different varieties and shades and nuances. Some of the most profound experiences I've had in my life are in that department with my consorts, who have taught me immensely. I've learned from the amazing women that have taught me stuff over the years. I wouldn't be who I am without all that. So that's Tibetan Buddhism, and I think these two go really well together, because Tantra needs updating. To study Tantra, you know, traditionally you can do this at SOAS, where I used to study, School of Oriental and African Studies. They have all the texts, and scholars will pore over every little paragraph of meaning. They're all a bit arcane and archaic. You know, Vajra Tantra, you invoke a particular deity conceived in a particular form of an icon with so many arms and heads and eyes, and you have to do it right. You know, you have to spend 3 years practicing in your monastery to get the visualization absolutely right, so you can see it with your eyes shut in 3D, and all the colours have to be right, the costume, you know, and the number of legs, and well, you know, okay, that had its time and place, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with doing that. But I'm saying that now, given the planetary emergency we're facing, when blokes are going in and shooting kids in schools, they're not going to have the patience to sit down and study the details of tantric iconography. You know, they'll shoot you if you suggest it. So we have to deliver the content of enlightenment, tantric enlightenment, to those kind of people that are misusing their masculinity. So they get it, and they get, oh God, it's compassion I should be doing. So instead of bursting into school shooting the kids, they go in, you know, we could invent a new thing. You have to get into the school and give a flower to one of the kids. Take a rose in. And that could be just as daring an experience, like breaking in and taking a flower. that will get them the same kudos in the masculine peer group. Yeah, I broke into what's its name high school and I delivered 3 daffodils the other day. Oh, great, round of applause. Instead of, I broke in and I shot 40 kids. We're living in what Buddhists call Kali Yuga. So I'd like to go back to the, we've got to deliver the compassion that Tantra teaches in a language these kind of people can understand. And likewise, I would say to the feminist and masculinist sort of communities, they also can sometimes get a bit, well, as we say in colloquial English, they can get on one. They can get too in your face with it. I was once in a relationship for 9 years with a very angry feminist who was, like old school 1960s feminist who thought all men were all evil. Why she was in a relationship with a man, I haven't got a clue, but she made my life absolute hell for 9 years because I was a man. And so whenever, it wasn't what I was doing, it was just ontologically there was something wrong with me. And so eventually I got out of that very toxic relationship, but it was, it was sad because what a waste. We could have had an amazing relationship if she just hadn't hated men and had this feminist anger in her. And I've met some others like that. I avoid relationships with them now. Once bitten, you don't get bitten again. But and also at that time, I think she's mellowed, but at that time she was intensely anti-spiritual. It seems to go along with 60s, certain types of 60s feminism, is that not only do you hate men, but you also hate God, because God is a male plot. So she hated Christianity, she absolutely loathed Islam, she hated Judaism because they have a male God. And there's lots of feminists like that. They're really angry with God, and they all become atheists because that's cleverer, they think. Well, I think that a bit of tantric practice would enlighten them a bit more, to be a bit more humble. I don't think hate is going to build a world civilization at peace. Hate isn't going to build trust and confidence between male and female, men and women on this planet now. I think we have to love God and the gods, understand them, understand all their nuances, see them, as it were, through a tantric perspective. Understand that Abraham and Moses and Jesus and Muhammad, they were just people on the path too, like us. They had amazing experiences and downloads, and none of them were omniscient or all perfect. They had their flaws, and that's why I've done the Tarot of the Gods for the men to understand, and the women who, to understand where all these different male gods come from and their priests like Moses and Abraham and stuff. So we don't have to hate them. We have to understand them, and that's what my experience of Tantric Buddhism taught me. Understand first, don't react emotionally, because Buddha means intellect, or the awakened intellect. So to become a Buddhist, I became a Buddhist at the age of 19. Well, whatever, maybe in previous lives I think I was a Buddhist, and it felt like coming home when I took the Mahayana vows to enlightenment in this lifetime for everybody, which is a bodhisattva vow. We can only get there with enlightenment and understanding, and that's why I've created the periodic table. Okay, there we are. That's an attempt at explaining the links between those two interesting boxes.
Cool.
Okay.
Thanks. Thank you. It was a scientism of philosophy, was there not? Or was that
there's philosophy of science.
in general systems theory?
Yeah, there's that one, which is 157.
So I would like to know about shamanism and its link to philosophy of science and general systems theory.
Right, shamanism is number one.
Mm.
Fascinating, the oldest one, and that's why it's like the hydrogen of the periodic table. That's why it's number one. It's a primal one we all come from. And then philosophy of science and general systems theory, great, 157, way down the bottom there. Yeah, good question. I mean, shamanism is the name used by religious studies scholars like me to denote the primal religions of the earliest times of oral culture, before writing, in which individual shamans going through spiritual experiences would have their own experience of navigating through the many worlds that we inhabit. And then Mircea Eliade came along and systematized the analysis of what those kinds of experiences are, whether in Central Asia, in Africa, in Australia, in Latin America, even in Europe. What he uses the term shamanism to mean is a certain type of prehistoric spirituality, and they follow the same sort of pattern. When you're young, you're somehow called by spirit to be of service to spirit in ways that you usually have to go through some death and resurrection experience. Your ego has to die, and you experience sometimes like a serious death experience. Sometimes it's accompanied by visual stuff, like you're being poked or stabbed or burned or whatever. And then your body is remade, it's reshaped. It's given like an adamantine crystal quality, usually. And then you can help. So having gone through the wounding, you become a healer. And the shamans, one of their main functions in all these tribal communities is as the healer. They're the doctors of our ancestors. If you have a broken bone or a sick mind, you take them to the shaman and they cure them. We also know these shamans, and they're still practicing today, there's lineages still alive, often use psychedelic, psychoactive substances, plant medicines, all of them really, in different dosages, different forms. And I've just finished reading a book by Graham Hancock, which he wrote in 2005, called Meetings with the Elders of Humanity, Supernatural, it's called. Recommend it, 600 pages. It's not an easy read, but it's worth it. And he answers this relationship in great detail because he's exploring and he goes and interviews scientists who are trying to understand the pharmacology of these psychedelic substances, particularly, well, not just from the Amazon, but the figures given in that book are fascinating. There's something like, quoting off the top of my head, 850,000 different plant species, still unknown to science, like nobody's analysed them, and like 70% of them are in the Amazon rainforest. And we don't know what they are, what they're made of, And what medical doctors are trying to do, and pharmacologists, is go and get as many of these things as they can, analyse them, and then turn them into a drug they can make a profit from. That's what Big Pharma's doing. What Graham Hancock is doing, and Jeremy Narby and other sort of people working on this, is to try and work uniting science with respecting the shamanic teachings. Not to exploit them, but to, if they can turn it into a marketable compound, then they get most of the profits. It goes to help their village and whatever they want to do with that money, which makes total sense. So, fortunately, that horrible president who was running Brazil for a while just fell from power. He was trying to cut down the entire Amazon for building supermarkets and stuff.